My name is Mark, and for 6 grueling months, my reality was the graveyard shift at a sprawling 24-hour megamart on the edge of town. There's a unique and profound emptiness that settles over a place like that after midnight. The cheerful daytime hustle is replaced by a humming, sterile silence, punctuated only by the buzzing of the overhead fluorescent lights and the distant whir of the floor polisher. Each aisle becomes a canyon of neatly stacked consumerism, a testament to a world that is fast asleep. My job was simple: patrol the store, ensure everything was in its place, and deal with the occasional lost soul looking for milk at 3 a.m. The toy aisle, aisle 12, was always the worst part of my route. It felt different. The rows of smiling plastic faces and vacant glass eyes seemed to hold a collective, silent judgment in the echoing quiet. The air was always colder there, a pocket of unnatural chill that clung to the skin and refused to dissipate. It was a place where the loneliness of the night shift felt most potent, where you could almost believe the whispers you heard were more than just the air conditioning.
The first incident was subtle enough to dismiss as a prank or simple carelessness. During my 2 a.m. sweep, I found a single porcelain doll sitting upright in the middle of the aisle, facing the main entrance. It was one of those old-fashioned types, with a frilly lace dress, perfectly coiled blonde hair, and a painted-on smile that seemed just a little too wide, a little too knowing. Its glass eyes had a depth that felt unnervingly lifelike under the harsh store lighting. Annoyed, I picked it up, its cold ceramic form sending a shiver through my hand, and placed it back on its designated shelf between a row of action figures and board games. I scanned the area, expecting to see my co-worker, Dave, hiding behind a display, ready to laugh. But there was nothing, just the endless humming silence and the rows of silent, watchful toys. I chalked it up to a customer, leaving it behind before closing, and forgot about it, continuing my patrol with the unsettling image of its smile lingering in my mind, a tiny crack in the mundane foundation of my night.
The following night, the doll was back. This time, however, it wasn't in the middle of the aisle. It was perched atop the highest shelf in the pet food section, 3 aisles away from its home. My blood ran cold. There was absolutely no way it could have gotten there on its own. The shelf was at least 15 feet high, requiring a specialized ladder that only certified employees had access to, and I was the only one on the floor at that hour besides Dave, who was busy waxing the floors at the opposite end of the store. I radioed him, my voice trembling slightly. "Dave, are you messing with me? The doll from aisle 12? His reply was a crackle of confusion. "What doll, man? I'm over by the dairy. Haven't been near the Tules all night." A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I got the ladder, my hands slick with sweat, and retrieved the doll. As my fingers closed around its dress, I could have sworn I felt a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, like a tiny, trapped heartbeat. I forced it back onto its shelf in aisle 12, my own heart now pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and I avoided that section for the rest of my shift. The third night was when my sanity truly began to fray. I approached aisle 12 with a heavy sense of foreboding, my flashlight beam cutting nervously through the gloom. The doll was not on its shelf. Instead, every single doll on that shelf had been turned around to face the back wall, except for one empty space where the porcelain doll should have been. Then I heard it, a faint, high-pitched giggle that seemed to echo from the end of the aisle. It sounded like a little girl, but the sound was thin, distorted, like a recording played on an old, warped tape. My breath hitched. I swept my flashlight beam down the aisle, and there, sitting in a child's miniature shopping cart at the far end, was the doll. Its head was slightly tilted, and in the beam of my light, its painted smile seemed to stretch into a grotesque, mocking grin. That was it for me. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the figure, turned and ran directly to the security office, the sound of that tiny, cold laughter following me through the vast, empty store, a sound that promised I was not, and had never been, alone.
I quit the next day. I tried to explain what had happened to my manager, a weary man who had heard every excuse in the book. He just sighed, looked at the security footage, which, of course, showed nothing out of the ordinary, and told me that the graveyard shift can play tricks on your mind. He offered me a coffee and a different route, but I refused. I couldn't set foot in that building again after dark. I don't know what resides in that toy aisle, but it's something ancient and playful in the most malevolent way possible. Sometimes, when I'm trying to sleep, I can still hear that faint, tinny giggle echoing in the quiet of my room, and I see those vacant glass eyes and that impossibly wide smile. I left that job, but a part of that place, a cold porcelain fragment of its nightly horror, never left me. I learned that some things don't need the dark to be terrifying. Sometimes the brightest places hold the deepest shadows, waiting for the world to turn its back so they can come out and play their wicked games.
My name is Sarah. For nearly a year, I worked the night shift stocking shelves at a massive, soulless supermarket. It was a job that existed in a strange bubble of time, a world apart from the sunlit reality most people knew. The cavernous store, a vibrant hub of activity by day, transformed into a quiet, echoing mausoleum at night. The only sounds were the hum of the freezers, the squeak of my cart's wheels, and the distant, rhythmic drone of the floor buffer. My domain was the canned goods section, Aisle 9, a long, monotonous corridor of preserved foods. The work was repetitive, almost meditative. Slice open a box, place the cans on the shelf, label facing out, crush the cardboard, repeat. It was a lonely job, but there was a strange peace to it, a sense of being the secret caretaker of a sleeping giant. The other night shifters were ghosts in their own right, figures I'd see occasionally at the far end of an aisle or during a shared, silent coffee break in the sterile employee lounge. We were a small nocturnal tribe, bound by our shared isolation and the fluorescent glow that served as our sun and moon.
It started on a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday, the nights all blurred into one. I was at the far end of aisle 9, methodically stocking cans of creamed corn when I saw her. At the other end of the aisle, a woman stood perfectly still, her back to me. She was wearing a simple, faded floral dress that looked like it belonged to another era, something my grandmother might have worn in the 1950s.
Her hair was tied back in a neat, old-fashioned bun. She was just standing there, her head slightly tilted, as if she were intently reading the label on a can of peas. It was strange. We were hours past closing, and the security guard, a heavy-set man named Frank, was meticulous about clearing the store. I assumed she must have hidden somewhere and gotten locked in. I called out, "Ma'am, the store is closed. You need to come with me to the front." She didn't move, not a twitch. Her stillness was unnatural, like a statue placed in the middle of the aisle. I started walking toward her, the squeak of my shoes suddenly deafening in the silence. "Ma'am," I called again, a little louder this time. Still nothing.
As I got closer, a feeling of unease began to crawl up my spine. The air around her seemed to shimmer slightly, and a distinct chill settled around me, the kind that has nothing to do with the temperature. I was about halfway down the aisle when she simply vanished. It wasn't that she turned and ran. There was nowhere to go. Aisle 9 was a long, unbroken stretch with no cross aisles. One moment she was there, a solid presence at the end of the aisle, and the next she was gone. The space where she had stood was now empty. I stood frozen for a full minute, my heart hammering against my ribs. I ran to the end of the aisle, checking behind the promotional displays, but there was nothing. I immediately went to Frank in the security office and asked him to check the cameras for aisle 9. He rewound the tape, his brow furrowed. The footage showed me, alone, stocking shelves and then suddenly stopping to stare at nothing at all. There was no one else there. He patted my shoulder and told me I was probably just overtired, but the image of her faded floral dress was seared into my mind.
The sightings became a regular, terrifying part of my routine. Every few nights, she would be there, always in aisle 9, always in the same spot, always wearing that same dated dress. She never acknowledged me, never turned around. Her presence was always accompanied by that same deep, penetrating cold that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried different approaches. I tried ignoring her, my back rigid as I stalked shelves, pretending she wasn't there. I tried walking past her quickly, my eyes averted. One night, I even tried running toward her the moment I saw her, hoping to catch her off guard, but she dissolved into thin air before I could get within 10 feet. My obsession grew. I needed to see her face. I needed to understand what was happening. My work suffered. My hands would shake so badly I could barely stack the can straight. The other stalkers started giving me a wide berth, whispering that the night shift was finally getting to me. But I knew what I saw was real. The story began to take shape after I spoke with Maria, one of the daytime cleaners who had worked at the store since it opened 20 years prior. I described the woman in the faded dress, and Maria's face went pale. She crossed herself and told me a local legend I'd never heard. The supermarket, she said, was built on the land where the old Miller farmhouse once stood. The farmhouse had burned to the ground in a terrible fire in the late 1950s, and the entire family had perished. Mrs. Miller, she whispered, was known for her love of gardening and her handmade floral dresses. She was last seen in the pantry, surrounded by her canned goods, trying to save them from the flames. The description matched perfectly. I suddenly understood why she was always there, in aisle 9, forever trapped in the modern-day equivalent of her home's pantry, forever looking for something she could never save.
That night, armed with this terrible knowledge, I saw her again. She stood at her usual spot, a silent sentinel among the Campbell's soup and Del Monte green beans. But this time, something was different. I didn't approach her. I didn't call out. I just stood at my end of the aisle and watched. Slowly, as if she could feel my gaze, she began to turn. The movement was agonizingly slow, jerky, and unnatural. The temperature in the aisle plummeted, and I could see my own breath fogging in the air. As her head completed its turn, I finally saw her face. It was a nightmarish canvas of melted, charred flesh, with 2 dark, empty pits where her eyes should have been. A silent, gaping mouth was frozen in a scream that I felt in my bones rather than heard with my ears. The raw, eternal agony in that look shattered something inside me. The figure held my gaze for a heart-stopping moment before flickering and dissolving, leaving me alone and trembling in the sudden oppressive silence of the aisle.
I didn't finish my shift. I dropped my box cutter, abandoned my cart full of canned peaches, and walked out of the store into the pre-dawn grayness. I never went back. I never explained to anyone the real reason I left. How could I? How could I explain that I had seen the ghost of a woman burned alive, a spirit tethered to a place that no longer existed, a place now paved over with linoleum and stocked with the very items she died trying to protect? I moved to a different city, took a day job, and tried to forget. But sometimes, when I'm in a grocery store and I walk down the canned goods aisle, I feel that familiar, unnatural chill, and I have to fight the urge to run. I know she's still there, forever shopping in the silent fluorescent-lit falls of her own personal hell, and I fear that one day she might just follow me home.
My name is David, and my job for 3 years was to be the all-seeing eye of a Walmart supercenter. I was the night security guard, but my domain wasn't the store floor. It was a small, windowless room in the back, smelling faintly of stale coffee and old electronics. The walls were lined with a bank of 64 black and white monitors, a silent, flickering grid that represented every corner of the vast retail space. My nights were a long, slow ballet of boredom, watching the cleaning crew push their buffers across the gleaming floors and the stalkers move like ghosts through the aisles. The cameras were old, the resolution grainy, and the footage was often filled with visual noise and artifacts. You learned to filter it out, to recognize the difference between a moth fluttering in front of a lens and something that required a closer look. For the most part, nothing ever happened. The store at night was a sealed tomb, and I was its sole, underpaid watchman, staring into the abyss of grayscale monotony, waiting for my shift to end.
The anomaly began on Cam 12, a fixed camera pointed down a long, narrow service corridor in the deep warehouse section.
a place where pallets of overstock were stored and forgotten. It started as a subtle flicker, a brief distortion in the feed that I barely registered. I'd blink and it would be gone. I initially blamed the aging coaxial cables or a power fluctuation. These things were common. But the flicker became more frequent, and then it started to take on a shape. It was a tall, impossibly thin shadow that would dart from one side of the corridor to the other with a speed that defied the camera's low frame rate. It was there, and then it was gone. A vertical smear of black against the gray concrete wall. I spent hours rewinding and rewatching the tapes, trying to isolate the phenomenon. Each time I played it back, the image was too distorted to be certain of what I was seeing. It was just a smudge, a ghost in the machine. My supervisor, a gruff man named Henderson, laughed at me when I showed him. "It's a rat, Dave, or a damn glitch. Stop staring at the screen so hard, you'll go crazy." But it wasn't a rat. The shape became more defined over the next few weeks. It gained a crude form, like a stick figure drawn by a child with a trembling hand, but elongated and stretched, as if it were being viewed through a warped lens. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide or jerk from place to place, sometimes appearing in one spot and then instantly in another, further down the hall, with no visible movement in between. It was always confined to the feed of Cam 12. One night, I watched it stand perfectly still in the center of the corridor for over an hour. My curiosity finally got the better of my fear. I had to see what was there with my own eyes. I grabbed my heavy maglite, its beam a comforting weight in my hand, and left the security of my little room. The walk through the silent store to the back warehouse was the longest of my life. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound was magnified. I reached the service corridor, took a deep breath, and shone my light down its length. It was completely, utterly empty. Not even a draft. Just cold, still air and the smell of dust and cardboard.
I returned to my booth, my heart a little calmer, convinced my mind was playing tricks on me. I sat down and my eyes went immediately to the monitor for Cam 12. My blood turned to ice. The figure was still there, standing in the exact same spot in the corridor I had just left. It hadn't moved. It was on the screen, but it wasn't in the hallway. It existed only in the electronic feed. As I stared, paralyzed by this impossible fact, the figure on the screen began to move. It didn't jerk or dart this time. It turned, slowly, deliberately, its featureless head rotating until it was staring directly into the camera lens. It was looking at me. A wave of static crackled through the audio feed from the corresponding microphone, and through the hiss I heard a sound, a dry, whispering voice that seemed to be formed from the static itself. It was a single, drawn-out word that I couldn't quite decipher, a sound that felt ancient and wrong, a violation of the silence. The feeling of being watched was no longer passive. It was an active, malevolent pressure. The figure on the screen remained motionless, staring.
Then it slowly raised a long, spindly arm, its finger impossibly thin, and began to trace something on the concrete wall behind it. The grainy resolution made it hard to see, but the intent was clear. It was writing. I leaned closer, my face inches from the glass of the monitor, squinting, trying to make out the shapes. It looked like letters. I rewound the tape, playing it back in slow motion, again and again. The static-laced whisper repeated each time, a sound that scraped at the inside of my skull. Finally, I saw it. The letters were crude, uneven, but unmistakable. It had written my name, D-A-V-I-D. The camera wasn't just showing me something in the store. Something in the store was using the camera to show me it knew who I was.
That was the moment the barrier between observer and observed was irrevocably broken. This thing wasn't just a passive anomaly. It was an intelligence, and it had singled me out. It wasn't in the hallway. It was in the system. It was a digital phantom that had somehow gained a terrifying awareness. I didn't wait for it to write anything else. I didn't wait to see if it would move again. I scrambled out of my chair, stumbling over my own feet, and fled the security room. I didn't bother to lock it. I ran through the dark, silent store, past the aisles of products that suddenly seemed like tombstones, and burst out the emergency exit into the cool night air. The blare of the alarm was a welcome sound, a chaotic noise that drowned out the terrifying whisper in my head. I never clocked out. I got in my car and drove, and I didn't stop until the sun came up.
I never went back, and I never told anyone the full story. They would have thought I was insane, but I know what I saw. I saw something that lived in the space between the real and the recorded, something that had been watching the watchers for God knows how long. To this day, I can't stand being on camera. I cover the webcam on my laptop, and I get a panicky feeling when I see a security dome in a store. I have this recurring nightmare where I'm back in that little room and all 64 monitors are black except for one. On that one screen, in grainy black and white, is a live feed of me sleeping in my own bed. And in the corner of the room, a tall, thin shadow is slowly turning its head to look right at me, a dry whisper of my name hissing from the speakers.